One of the interesting things about health and healing, if this evening's text and stories like it are any indication, is that it's not always immediately and readily embraced by those to whom it is offered, or by the community that witnesses when it starts to unfold. This can be true for individuals and for families and for communities and even for whole societies. There's something in us that can get used to the way things are, even if the way things are is painful and otherwise dysfunctional, even if there's a lot of collateral damage that comes along with maintaining the status quo, whatever it is. There's something in us that can get kind of used to the way things are. Or maybe we simply get overwhelmed. Too sick and tired to spot any of the signs of hope around us, too sick and tired to believe that a new perspective is possible, or to have the energy to even imagine something different. Perhaps we even experience some benefits, some secondary gains in our illness as individuals or as a society, like the Hebrew children out in the wilderness after God delivered them in the Exodus, longing to go back to Egypt, where at least they had 3 hots and a cot. There can be a certain security in the familiar, even if the familiar is oppressive. If you've been watching the TV show This Is Us, and it's one of my favorite TV shows, you see that storyline playing out in Kevin's life as he has returned to drinking. People lapse back into unhealthy patterns all the time. Newness of life can be scary. It can be tempting to believe that returning to the bondage we know beats having to trust God to lead you and me and our larger world into newness, especially when change is required of us, or when it feels like our hopes have been dashed at least once, if not twice, or 3 times, or 50 times too often. No wonder our offers of healing are not always immediately and readily embraced. Take tonight's passage from John's Gospel. Perhaps noticed what happened when Jesus came upon the man who was lying there by the pool of Bethesda, which was renowned for its curative properties. When Jesus asked the man who had been ill for 38 years, "Do you want to get well?" The man didn't say yes. He didn't say yes. To be fair, he didn't say no either. What he did instead was to provide a couple of excuses as to why he hadn't yet experienced healing. "Sir, I have no one to put me in the pool. And when I'm making my way, someone steps in front of me." Now, the tradition that had grown up around that pool was that when the waters were stirred up every so often, and that only happened every so often, and a person waded into those waters that had been stirred up, they'd be made well. There was a whole group of people who gathered around that pool on the regular, waiting for the bubbles to come up, looking for the healing to come. And to add another wrinkle, some ancient authorities add that it was only the first person in the water after it bubbled who would receive the healing. First come wasn't just first served. First come was the only one served. You can see how the whole thing could literally become a when push comes to shove event. Dog eat dog, zero-sum game, a Darwinian experience. It's not the sort of thing that encourages cooperation among people. We don't know if the guy had been hanging out around that pool off and on for 38 years in his affliction, but we do know that by the time Jesus found him, his spirit was crushed. His community had failed him. The odds were stacked against him. He couldn't even answer in the affirmative when asked if he wanted to be made well. He couldn't imagine getting well. But in this story, as in many, Jesus operates outside the confines of the system. Rather than hanging around and helping the man elbow his way into the pool the next time the waters got roiled, Jesus simply says to the man, "Rise, take up your mat and walk." And the man does. He doesn't have to be first into the pool. He doesn't even have to get into the pool at all. He just needs to stand up, take his mat, and walk. And that's exactly what he does. Yeah, now you think that would be cause for rejoicing, right? The feel-good story of the year, headline in the Jerusalem Post, local man, lame for 38 years, miraculously walks again, and he didn't even have to get in the pool. However, the religious authorities are not happy to see it. They're upset. It's the Sabbath, they say. Why are you carrying your mat? Of course, he's carrying his mat because that's what the man who made him well said he should do. So that's what he tells them. But you might ask why John's Gospel has Jesus ask him to carry his mat in the first place. It's as if Jesus knows that this is going to stir things up and perhaps offer an opportunity for healing, just like the water stirred up at the Sodom. It's going to offer an opportunity for healing because it places the issue in stark relief. What matters more? Purity and ritual observance, or the expression of compassion to a person who had been at least partially paralyzed and left by the wayside for more years than anyone could count? Well, when the religious authorities can only see a man violating the tradition by carrying his mat on the Sabbath and not a healed child of God, you know what their answer is. What's more important is purity, not compassion. One of the great contributions Marcus Board made to my understanding of and approach to Scripture was to set the conflict Jesus had with the religious authorities of his day in terms of a battle of values. One side, for understandable reasons, and there are whole sermons that could be preached about that, value purity. Purity of tradition, purity of religious and ethnic identity, purity of religious observance. The other side, represented by Jesus, valued compassion above all else. For Jesus, what ultimately mattered was compassion. Compassion to the sick, to the lame, to the stranger, to the outsider, to the immigrant, to the hungry and the thirsty, to the widow, to the orphan, to the vulnerable, to those who were in prison. And if that meant healing on the Sabbath, then so be it. And if that meant running afoul of parts of his religious tradition and all the rules that had built up around it, then so be it. And if that meant going toe-to-toe with a system that looked the other way when the lame and the blind needed help, when the person from another religious tradition, like a Samaritan or a Gentile, needed a welcome, when those in poverty went hungry or thirsty, then so be it. He was up to the task, Jesus was, because he came to be the embodiment of a love that would not look the other way. So I wonder if Jesus' question to the man in today's story, do you want to get well, wasn't also in its way a question to the authorities who were so bent on purity of ethnic and religious identity and religious observance, so set on determining who was out and who was in, that they not only failed to celebrate the healing of a lame man, they also overlooked so many other people who needed help and welcome. Perhaps in healing the man by the pool of Bethesda, Jesus was asking the religious and political systems of his day, do you want to get well? Or just at least a little bit healthier? Can you even imagine that that's possible? I don't know about you, but since Friday, my imagination has been challenged. Can I even imagine that it's possible for our society, for our world, to get well? Heck, maybe not even fully well, just a little bit healthier. Do we want to get well? Maybe that's a question for our day too. Because as the massacre in the two mosques in New Zealand on Friday makes clear, there are still people in the world who place misguided notions of purity, ethnic, religious, and otherwise, above the call to live together in peace and to welcome one another in compassion. when people who are in worship are gunned down, and it's happened in all traditions, when people who are in worship are gunned down in worship, there's a problem. To see the consequences of Western white supremacist ideology on display like it was in the actions of that shooter is horrifying. It's horrifying. And it should be. It ought to drive us to our knees in prayer and then cause us to stand up to clearly and unequivocally challenge any and all who spout or fail to question such detestable ideas. We have to even question each other. If we want to get well, when push comes to shove, we'll need to stand up. Stand up for compassion and grace and tolerance and mercy. Earlier in the sermon, I said that the man who was ill had been sick for too many years to count. Actually, maybe you caught this in the reading of Scripture. It was 38 years. 38 years of not being well. Now, John's gospel takes pains to say that it's 38 years, and that's really sort of an odd number. I mean, it's an even number, but it's sort of an odd number. I mean, why 38 years? For students of Scripture, and there would have been more of them back when John wrote his gospel, more who knew the Torah at least and knew it by heart, the number might have taken them back to Deuteronomy 2:14, which says that 38 years was the length of time that the Israelites had traveled in the wilderness from Kadesh Barnea to the time when they crossed the Wadi Zered. I had to look that up. You can look it up too. It took 38 years, Deuteronomy says, for the entire generation of warriors who set out from the Exodus couldn't imagine embracing something different to perish so that the community could be ready to enter the promised land. 38 years the man was sick. 38 years people wandered. It's a long time. I have a colleague named Scott Erickson who wrote the following piece on Friday about imagination and about getting well. This is what he said. Is there any meaning in all of this? Asked a woman to a priest after the Sandy Hook shooting. Not yet, replied the priest. Erickson goes on to write, my heart goes out to the victims of a hate-based mass shooting in New Zealand that just happened. Human beings, again, human beings, gathered in their religious practice, as we define as Islam, were targeted because of an imagined threat. Imagined threat. That's all it is. Someone's imagination. Our imagination, Erickson writes, is the force behind our greatest accomplishments and our greatest atrocities. Space flight and Jewish gas chambers both came from imagination. Be attentive, says Erickson, to what you are being told to imagine. It has consequences. And once again, that consequence of imagination has cost human lives. We grieve today, he writes, and I hope that all the loss and grieving could at least resurrect a better imagination. It's incumbent upon all of us in these days to imagine what it would be like to act first in compassion, to put compassion first. That's how we get well. This morning we had a marvelous moment for young disciples. Pastor Susan said, it all starts from one person. Like Kevin Casto's bunch of Beanie Babies, and how his mom and dad decided that now that he's an adult and working in the real world, that they should donate them to the church. And how Susan came up with the idea of pew pets so that children under the age of 8 would at least have something to hold on to during worship. And then M.L. Sharp decided that there should be a book written about it, and Ford Peele wrote and illustrated that book, which was just presented this morning. I have a starring role in the book. What if all the